Okay. In that case, we'll get underway. We're now at the next to the last talk, one more to go. So the time is getting a little tighter, as you know. But without any further ado, we get down to a big topic that the truth is, when I wrote up, I said, this takes 4 talks by itself. I'm not going to do that. So I'll do bits and pieces of the Jewish world and its culture in the mid-'70s as time permits, which is not that long ago. I think we all remembered it, but I don't think we all lived around the world, except maybe some of us did. Let me start by pointing out in general terms that Jewish geographical changes of a significant nature have taken place in the last 150 years. So for many centuries, the Jews lived in a certain set of places, basically what you and I would call Europe and the Middle East. For a long, long time. How long have the Jews been in Poland? A long time, baby, right? How long have the Jews been in Germany? A very long time, baby, right? Centuries, the 1200s, the 1100s, and all that sort of thing. And they never left. And as far as the Middle East is concerned, although it's a slightly variegated, the Jews have been in Egypt for a very, 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 very long time, baby, right? All the way back, never stopped. And the Ottoman Empire captured a third of Europe, and wherever the Turks ruled, it was quote-unquote good for the Jews. They may have been treated as dhimmi citizens, but nevertheless, there were Jewish communities that lived and flourished all throughout what you and I would call today the Balkans and the Eastern Central Europe, countries like Romania and Hungary and the south of them. So these are the map where Jews were century, and nowhere else. There weren't any Jews in Japan, there weren't any Jews hardly in India, there weren't any Jews, in this place and that place. And then it starts to change, basically at least 150 years. That's very interesting. In other words, in the overall Jewish picture, what shall I say, the glacier starts to move. And the diaspora, of course, used to be located, as I think you know, most of the Jews lived, this area by the time you get to 1800s, this area is Poland, agreed? It's in the Russian Empire, but it's Poland, the kingdom of Poland that the Russians annexed. And if you recall, I told you many times, the Russian government wouldn't allow Jews to live in Russia proper, only in the provinces of Poland that they'd taken over. That's what they call in the books the Pale of Settlement. Okay? You're in Russia, but you can't move anywhere in Russia. So basically, Jews are only allowed to live, if you want to parallel, in the south. They can go to Atlanta, they can go to Charleston, but they can't move to the north, they can't move to the Midwest and so forth. That's what it was like in Russia. Germany, where Jews were there beforehand. What you see over here, this is Galicia, this is Bohemia, Hungary, long-term Jewish settlement. Okay, but then it starts to change. Radical geographical change starts in 1880. If you want to be technical, 250,000 Jews moved from here to America. But here you start seeing some of the pictures from the Pale of Settlement only, from the Russia part. And look at these numbers. These numbers are not exactly correct, they're a little bit low, but it doesn't matter for our purposes. Nearly 2 million from the Pale Settlement to America, right? If you throw in Canada, it's mamish close to 2 million. 100,000 over here, 45,000 there, 250,000 to England, and so on and so forth, right? In other words, you start to see significant numbers pick a move. It's a good thing they did that. Would you agree with me? This is not the place you want to live in the 20th century. So anybody here in this audience whose grandparents or whatever got off the boat, went to Ellis Island around 1900 or thereabouts, go over and kiss the grave because you ducked a bullet. Agreed? But in the larger picture of Jewish history, this is phenomenal because usually Jews don't move. And so you start to see this significant change starting in 1880. That's besides, this does not include Galicia and Romania, which you can add another 250,000 or so. So when you pick that up and throw that into America, you're definitely over the 2 million mark. It's really even more. Galicia, for example, is not small. That's Galicia. I was just there this past summer in eastern Galicia. You get it. This is just a piece of Poland, but today it's Poland and Ukraine. This part is Poland, this part is Ukraine. That time was all part of Austria-Hungary, part of the old Kingdom of Poland. I'm simply pointing out, it's not a tiny piece of territory. We're not talking about Rhode Island over here, okay? So when we talk about significant Jewish emigration simply from the province of Galicia, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, okay? Now, unfortunately, they're all Galicianers, but they nevertheless. Now, in other words, about 3 million people got the heck out of there just before the First World War, just before the Second World War, creating a new diaspora, whose peak years were 1914 to 1942. Those are the years of the coming together and the increasing numbers of the new diaspora. For example, what you would call today, to use simple terms that you'll understand, the Lower East Side, Hester Street. That's new. Get it? And multiply that across America, or across London and France and other places. That's really a new phenomenon in Jewish history. Okay, hold that thought. And now, let's consider the new diaspora that emerges post-1945. That's a different thing, okay? That's a different thing. Now, right? I mean, you know the tragic arithmetic, do we not? Let's go to the next one. Used to be 3 million, now it's 45,000 after the Holocaust. Things like that. There was a thing called the Shoah, if you haven't heard about it. So the tragic arithmetic is what it is. Part of the new diaspora, what I mean to say by that is the center of Judaism, Jewish life, is no longer going to be where it was. For many, many centuries, this was where Judaism, from and not from, was. And all the other places were sort of colonies of it. If we go back to 100 years to 1918, even if you had 3 million Jews in New York City, all of them were a colony of Lithuania and Poland and places like that, right? That's what it was. There is no home territory, obviously, after the Holocaust, after 1945. So what is this new diaspora? Part of the post-1940 diaspora will be from the Muslim countries, as we shall see tonight. There had not been a significant immigration from the Muslim countries prior to the Second World War. It was a little bit, but nothing real. The Sephardim, if we want to use a broad category and use this in a broad term, you can divide it into two parts, North Africa and everything else. Okay? And North Africa is big. You got, Morocco is very big, the Jewish community there, and Algeria, and Tunisia, and Egypt even had 75,000 Jews back in 1945, and Libya, and so on and so forth. And some of them are very old communities, I might add, old communities with a very strong Judaism, with a very strong Torah tradition, to use the current terminology. It's not just fly-by-night communities. They have their own deeply rooted, long-standing, realities. Now, during the years 48 to 67, the new state of Israel sucks in Jews, but from two places. Number one, from the Iron Curtain, and number two, from the Muslim countries. That's where Israel got its immigrants, right? The Jews elsewhere are not interested in making Aliyah. Ben Gurion went into a rage all the time, if anybody's old enough to remember that. But why would a Western Jew want to live like Salah Shabati? Right? That's the bottom line. And so, Ben Gurion was delusional. He used to talk to Jacob Blaustein over here and say, oh, the American Jews should all move to Israel and this and that and the other. And Blaustein said, I'll take that under advisement, I don't think he's moving from whatever mansion he had in America. I don't blame him. He was the head of the President's Jewish Conference and so forth. Why does Blaustein want to live like this? Okay? Why does he want to live in a Ma'abara? And even if you get not a Ma'abara, why do you want to live under a socialist economic regime like you had under Ben Gurion? Why would you want to do it? And so that gives you the demographic and diaspora realities of the post-1948 situation in Israel. In the 1950s, and it's a big insult, the North African Jews don't want to live like this. And so at least half of the North African Jews go to France and not to Israel. When they leave, they're not going to go to Israel because they don't want to live like Salah Shabati. Who can blame them? What do I mean when I say who can blame them? If you go to France, you won't be shafted that way. Let me put it to this way. 90% of Algerian Jews go to France. 10% go to Israel. That's a big diss, okay? I'm talking about in the 50s when Algeria blew up, and it was a uprising, against the French, and then it got violent. You just couldn't stay there anymore. So they moved with their feet. And what people really believe is not what they say in a TV interview, and not what they give a check somewhere, is where they move with the family. You understand? And 90% of the Algerian Jews, and significant percentages of the Moroccan, Tunisian, Jews are going to France. That's how it goes. Who, by the way, had a liberal reception policy. Notice he got a pension from the government of some kind or another, subsidy towards housing and things of that nature, which was more than what Israel had to offer you. Okay, and believe it or not, this is very sad. You did not have the same racism, especially in the 50s and 60s, in France that you had to Israel. That's what it goes. If you're a French Jewish kid and you can make the grades, the sky's the limit. You know, you can go and it'll be subsidized all the way to the Sorbonne, as it were, and many did. Derrida, I might remind you, for example, is an Algerian Jew. You see, who goes to the very peak of French culture. It could never happen in Israel, I'm sorry to say, in those years. Nowadays it's different, thank God, but in those years. So keep this in mind. Other North African Jews will go to England, to Italy, and other countries. They see their future there and they're not in Israel. It's a big diss on Ben Gurion. These Jews have declined to move to Israel ad hayom hazeh. Here we are in year 2018. Here we are in France, for example, with the huge influx of the Muslims, with the violence that we read about all the time, with the murders that we read about in Paris and elsewhere, which are not prosecuted by the police, and so on and so forth, with the hyper kasher, blow up and all the rest of it. And in spite of everything I just said, and Bibi went over there and made a whole speech, nobody's moving. A few thousand. I mean, I know the numbers like you know the numbers. 99% of the French Jews, it's like this. We prefer to live in Paris and France, surrounded by all these Muslims and all this other business, rather than move to the state of Israel. It's just an interesting phenomenon. Right? It's an interesting phenomenon. As a result, France has the third largest Jewish population today. It's Israel, it's America, it's France. Israel's what, 6 million, something like that? America is, the numbers are always funny, but let's say it's around 6 million. And France is about 800,000, something along those lines, 750,000. That's you're looking at. Russia and these other countries are much smaller these days because they made Aliyah. And so we're not used to thinking of France as being such a large part of the Jewish world. And it is. So therefore I turn my attention a little bit to France tonight in the limited time that I have. It's not only, but it's one of the things. The immigration of such a large number of these Jews into France will have both a positive and a negative effect on European Jewish life in terms of Yiddishkeit. On the one hand, these Jews who move there will Europeanize and acculturate. When they come in the 50s and the 60s, they do Europeanize. I'm talking about the Jews. And they come there to learn French and become Frenchies and all the rest of it. They will not be separatists like the Muslims who immigrate to Europe. You don't have anything remotely like that in terms of the French Jews. You have a neighborhood with some restaurants, but you don't have separate areas which are totally under Sharia law and, as you know, no-go zones for the police. And that's just not part of the Jewish experience in France at all. It's not what they're interested in. Now, this is not such a great thing in terms of Yiddishkeit. Not that I want Sharia law, but on the other hand, you have too much assimilation. And so the result is the best and the brightest of the North African Jews who will immigrate to France will be lost to Yiddishkeit. They'll be won to French. Take a look at this. Here's just a list. I just Googled it, of famous Algerian Jews who've hit the jackpot in France, Nobel Prize winners, professors in the universities, leading philosophers, and members of the French elite. It's a galaxy of names, as you see over here, and I don't know if that's all of them. Now, I'm not against that. I'm simply saying they're lost. Let's put it this way. In a perfect world, this did not happen, I get it. But in a perfect world, these names would be Israeli elitists, right? They'd be leaders of thought and culture and industry in the state of Israel, and so on and so forth. But they're not, right? And the people that I'm looking at on this list have basically, the ones that I know, basically have nothing to do with Yiddishkeit. This guy did, some of them, a few of them did, but the great majority not. Because Algeria was occupied by France in 1830, that's a long time ago. And the Algerian Jews wanted, long ago in the 1800s, to have a better treatment, and therefore they Gallicized, which is the expression, they Frenchified. And already back in Algeria, if you went back 1980, 100 years ago, many of them, not the ones living in the sticks, but the ones living in the larger cities, will go to French schools and identify with French culture and all the rest of it, and down goes the Yiddishkeit. That's the point I'm trying to make. Now, on the other hand, most of the Sephardic Jews are more traditional. I don't know about from, but certainly, as we know, much more traditional, and consequently have more of a Jewish flavor to French Jewish life over there, even if they don't keep everything. Let's analyze this for a minute, historically, because that's what I'm here for, in terms of demography and culture. France, Vazidos, okay? Now, the old France kicked the Jews out long ago, I mean, the 1500s, right? This is what Charles IX, who kicked the Jews out in 1394. Here's Louis XII, a very, very interesting king, by the way, who kicks the remaining Jews out of southern France. So long ago, when France was France, they made it clear they want no Jews. So this is like 1492, just is not so well known. Okay? Everybody's heard of 1492. Not so many people have heard of 1501. Fine. So they kicked the Jews totally out of France. It became illegal to live there and all the rest of it. In spite of what I just said, Jews penetrated back in two groups in a strange way. And I'm going to hope to do more about this in the next series I plan to do in the spring, when we talk about France and the French Revolution. Some of these Jews are Portuguese Jews, which we spoke about when we talk about the Moranos. And these are Spanish-Portuguese Jews who are Moranos, who are escaping the Inquisition. And it's just over the border, agreed? Spain and France are next to each other. So a number over the course of the 1500s to 1600s, 1700s, little groups, constant, tiny, drip of Spanish-Portuguese Jews will move to southern France, to Bordeaux, Marseille, Nice, Bayonne, and places like that. And why do they move to France? They will still be Christians, but there's no Inquisition. Does that make sense? It's a funny story. They moved to France, which is a Catholic country. It's equally prohibited for them to live as Jews in France as it is in Spain. So why would you want to go and move to France? I can hear if you move to Holland, but why do you want to move to France? And many do. And the answer is, this is Nebuch. And the answer is that a nicer jail is an attractive place. And so, wait a minute. If you move to Bordeaux, for example, from Portugal or from Spain, so you want to be Christian, and you go to church, but if you get together on Friday night with friends, who knows? There's no Inquisition, which is an organized snitch system where everybody tells you, and they say this guy's always getting together. In Spain and Portugal, they say they're always getting together, a Friday night. That's like a red flag. It's April. I see them going and buying bitter herbs in the marketplace. It's a red flag. People got killed for this in Spain and Portugal. Since there is no Inquisition in France, you have a privacy. You have a privacy for them. That's a Gan Eden. Publicly you're a Christian, but privately you can be as Jewish as you wish. There were Moranos back in the 1600s who excoriated their fellow Jews for moving to France and still keeping a double life, but that's what happened. What's interesting in France is over the course of time, the thing got out of the closet. Meaning, let's put it this way, these guys didn't go to church too often. Not that every Frenchman did either. They kind of minimal, attendance at religious ceremonies. They kind of keep to each other. You notice the same families are marrying each other and not marrying anybody else. It takes a little while, but they kind of figure out what's going on. But since these Portuguese Jews, from day one, were merchants and therefore were a plus for the economy, so the attitude of France was, don't ask, don't tell. So there are not a lot of them, and they dress like everybody else, and they're publicly Christian like everybody else, and therefore leave them alone. And as time went on beyond that, they were able to come fully out of the closet very slowly and actually say they're Jewish and build synagogues, provided they're not too ostentatious. But I repeat, really they're very assimilated already and they're very acculturated. Even though they are Jewish and they only marry each other, blah, blah, blah. So that's one group that returns to France. And the second group, so the Portuguese Jews that I just mentioned were highly acculturated. The second group were not. These were Jews from Alsace-Lorraine, or Alsace particularly. If you know your French history, France expanded eastward and took over the area of the Rhine as far as they could. That's Louis XIV, Louis XV, and with a lot of wars. And that means, like Russia, when they conquered new territory, they got a lot of Jews. By the time you're finished, they got like 60, 70,000 Jews. That's a lot, right? Something like that. It's a booby prize. But once again, these are Ashkenazi Jews, so it's just the same thing as Fiddler on the Roof. It's no different. Even though they're on the other side of Europe, they're Yiddish speaking, they live in shtetls, it's mamish, it's interesting, it's Fiddler on the Roof. It's a different type of Yiddish, but it's Yiddish. Get it? It's a different type of Yiddish, but it's a dialect of Yiddish. And they, by the way, they import their rabbis and relatives from Poland and back and forth. It's an extremely interesting phenomenon. And naturally, by the way, being Jews in that part of the world, their main trade is what? And the horses, That's what they do, right? Cattle, horses, things like that. Now, they supplied the French army. That's the reason I mentioned with all the cavalry. So consequently, they weren't kicked out of there. So you end up getting in the old France, by the time you get to the French Revolution, a Jewish community of like 50,000, something like that, more. After the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic periods, which I'm skipping, the French Jewry was about 70,000. The old French Jewry, mostly from Alsace-Lorraine Jews, who slowly but surely assimilate in the 1800s and 19th century. Slowly because they come from very frum traditional backgrounds, but surely because assimilate they do, baby. It happens, okay? This is the story of French Jews in the 19th century. And so again, let's go to the next one. Some of the most famous names, there's Rothschild, there's Adolf Cremieux. I mean, they have completely Frenchified themselves, okay? Maybe behind doors they talk a little bit Yiddish from the old days, but not really. And by the time their kids come along, it's highly assimilated, as we would say today, and highly acculturated. So the old France of 1800s, the Judaism over there, let's go, is Shvacham. Okay, everybody, even the rabbis have to dress like priests, and the most important ceremonies are the baby naming ceremonies, because that's what they do in church, and they have organs and all the other sorts of things like that. That's how it goes. And then in the 1880s, just like there was a wave into America from Eastern European Jews, there's also a wave of Eastern European immigration into France, which triples the population in 30 years, 40 years. Okay? So that completely had a big impact on French Jewry. No, it didn't. Why? Yes, the new immigrants are Yiddish speaking. They come from Poland, from Lithuania, and places like that. And the older generation is from, but the younger generation is French. Maybe you've heard of Yisrael Salanter. The last thing he did in his life was travel to Paris to try to organize the Yiddishkeit as he saw it, which is collapsing, having such devastating impact on the thousands of new Russian and Polish immigrants that are pouring into France, and their kids are going down the tubes in terms of their religion and their Judaism over there. And oh my goodness, what are you going to do about it? And that kind of broke his heart. It's one of the reasons he died when he did. And so this is not so dissimilar to what happened in the United States and elsewhere in the West. This is what happens in France if you're talking about 1900, 1918, 100 years ago, and all the rest of it. As far as Frumkeit is concerned, if you went to France, there's a tiny group of Yekis. This is the funny thing, Munk, they had their own little tiny bubble. And there's a not much larger group of Eastern European Frum Jews. They used to call it, they actually built themselves a nice little Agudas HaKehilos. Right, Agudas HaKehilos. And the idea over there was the French Jews said, too many oratoires, too many steeples. Can't you go, well, we'll give you some money, get all the steeples in one building. It shouldn't look so disrespectable for the guy. And so they built, there's a well-known synagogue in France today. It's a Shomer Shabbos place, but it's the exception. That's my point. You understand? It's the exception. Now, the Rabbanut in France, the rabbinate is officially Orthodox. But in the course of the 1800s, they bring in organs and who knows, all kind of things like that. It's a long story of its own. But there are many concessions that are made over there to what I would call today conservative Judaism, shall we say. In France, you have like a combination, but they never officially abandoned Orthodox, which is why they can shift back later on in the 20th century. So I'm describing for you a very anemic Judaism in France, despite the very large size of the population. It should be, one would have hoped or expected, that a country like France, which has such a rich tradition going back to Rashi and Tosfos and people like that, a very long history of intense Yiddishkeit and especially Jewish scholarship of the most significant variety, that now in the new France, which is liberal, democratic, tolerant, the Jewish community would produce a vibrant Jewish culture to equal that, at least that was in Eastern Europe or something like that. None of that. Okay, none of that. And that's where things stood up to 1945. And then what happens after 1945 is kind of interesting. Among the Ashkenazic Jews who have survived the war, you have a very small, it's interesting, BT movement, Baal Tshuva movement, very French, very intellectual, very interesting, but without influence on wide circles. Here's the big guy, Leon Ashkenazi, called Manitou. Remember Manitou from the James Fenimore Cooper novels, the Indian god. He knows everything, right? So even the idea that you would give a from guy named Manitou is like kind of cute. I walked by a Frenchy farm store in Mea Shearim not long ago, and I see Sifrei Manitou, and it's only but anyway, the reason I say it's very interesting is these circles are all highly educated types. People come back to Yiddish, not many, people come back to Yiddishkeit with 2 PhDs, with certificates from the most advanced institutions of learning. People who definitely made it in the French intellectual cultural world, which is much higher than the American one. This country's intellectual wasteland, So, what do you call it? And nevertheless, they find their way back to Judaism. So it's interesting on a human basis, but sociologically, it doesn't have a large kind of influence on the wider set of French Jews who are just starting to intermarry and leave and all that sort of business. Okay? Fine. And then comes the 50s, and they get this tidal wave of North African Jews. They just pouring in, start selling from Algeria, and then Morocco, and then Tunisia, and this and that and the other, and there goes the neighborhood. Now, some are, the French Jews, the Ashkenazis don't know what to do. Now, some are from, all of them just about, are traditional. And so, what if the French said, well, you have to attend the synagogues. Out go those organs, baby, right? Out go the triennial reading cycle, which the French rabbin had introduced, and so forth. Out go those Gentile choirs that they used to have over there. These are the 3 classic concessions made by left-wing orthodoxy in the open orthodoxy in the 19th century. It's organs, Gentile choirs, because after all, I mean, they're not violating anything Jewish, and organs, by the way, played by non-Jews, okay? And what do you call it? I know it sounds funny, this is what it was once upon a time. And the laning in the triennial cycle, okay? Right, whatever, that's right, that's correct. So there's, in fact, in France, in French, a synagogue is a bad word, le temple, it was called the temple. So all this is part of the 19th century business. But here come these guys from Morocco. They said, what the heck is going on over here? Same thing happened in other European countries as well. The oilam for this kind of business died out in the Second World War. You understand? The people that are attracted to the synagogue to come, that kind of European bourgeois element was killed out or left by 1945. And therefore is not attractive anymore. We were, you were there. We went to Italy a couple years ago, and one of the places we went to was Livorno, Leghorn, and the old shul was bombed out, so they rebuilt a new shul in the early 60s. Nice, very nice synagogue. And I remember we had somebody was giving us a lady's giving us a talk there. Nice large shul, something along the lines of where now Shomri, maybe it was a little taller. And she's talking, and me being me, I started wandering around looking at different parts, and I see behind the Aron Kodesh is like a certain balcony, and I figure to myself, ooh, Sephardim for duchening, because the Sephardim duchen every day. Very cool, like the great synagogue in Jerusalem. So I go up there, look behind. No, that's where they used to have the organ. But no, and it's dust covered. You understand? In other words, when the Libyan Jews moved to Livorno, all the rest said, out goes that thing. Because the sensibilities change. You get it? The organ is a 19th century mishigas. It is. And in this country and over there in Europe as well. It had nothing to do with Judaism. It was a sign of acculturation. We have American and Michigasin of our own. That was a European one, and a lot of ink was spilled over the question of the organs back and forth, and if this one plays it and that one plays it. But in the 20th century, in the 21st century, it's not a big item anymore. Is anybody old enough to remember in Baltimore the microphone was a big hot item once upon a time? And now it's not something that you're not bringing in people because they have a mic or something. The sensibilities, the sociology perhaps has changed. And this is an example of it. And the main point is not that the Italian Jews got religion, not that the Frenchies all of a sudden turned to the right. It's a new element in the shuls. You understand? It's a new element in the community. And the new element of these Jews from Morocco. And the new element of these Jews from Tunisia. and it's more religious, it's less religious, but they, it's the old style like this. But when I go to a shul, I want a shul. I've heard people in Europe tell me this. They says, I don't go to shul, but when I go to a shul, it's supposed to be a shul. You see? And that's a very traditionalistic sensibility. It's a very Sephardic sensibility, particularly in North Africa. And therefore, you can multiply this in Holland, that I know about, in England in some places, in France and Italy. That's what I know offhand. Okay? It's just an interesting business. I'm just reminded off the top of my head, in '56, which is around this time, that's when the first time the RCA sent a delegation to Eastern Europe. If anybody's old enough to remember this. There was Herschel Schechter's, J.G. Schechter's father, and led it, and Rabbi Hollander, the rabbis of yesteryear, at that time, and Rabbi Miller, whatever. There was a good thing. And they went to Soviet Russia, they met with Khrushchev, and this and that and the other. That time it was a big innovation. And I just have to remember that they went to Bucharest, and there they were received by the chief rabbi Rosen, and they had this big fancy old synagogue left from the 19th century, and I think it's an organ or a microphone, one or the other, and they said like this, they said, well, we can't daven over there. Oh, why not? It's up to the latest thing. Well, it's the first time these Romanian, what shall I say, modernist Jews heard that there's something wrong with it, and so they got rid of it 1, 2, 3. Because if the America was the cutting edge, is if the Americans say that it's not up to par, then we don't want it, it's not fashionable anymore. So it's a matter of fashion. Anyhow, be that as it may, I'm simply telling you this because this happens socially in Western Europe. Among North African Jewry, some interesting developments had started to occur already when they were in North Africa before they left. And they were off the radar screen for most of us, unfortunately bigoted Ashkenazis. What they call Tahalich HaChilun, a process of secularization had already started to commence in North Africa long before this under French and Italian influence in the French and Italian territories that constituted all of North Africa. Okay? This is what it was. And so it's not the old school in Morocco anymore, when people dress like this. These are from Delacroix, by the way, right? Painted a Jewish wedding in the old days, in the 1800s. Meaning, once upon a time, the Jewish quarter was a closed place, and it was intensely Jewish, but very heavy Arabic influence, the old Sephardic style, and so on and so forth. However, let's go to the next one. Now you already have the same place. You already start to see, by the styles of everybody, a incipient Europeanization, in which they want to westernize, and there's a lot of pictures like this, and therefore, in terms of education, in terms of Shomer Shabbos, in terms of 100 other things, there's a definite move away from traditional observance in Morocco, in many circles, in Algeria very heavily, in Libya very heavily, and in Tunisia 50-50. That's how, and in Egypt very heavily, right? Some of you, I'm sure, read the Ovadia Yosef biographies that are out now. I'm sure of that. And you see, oh my goodness, they gave him a hard time when the year or two that he was in Egypt. What did he want? Kosher food in the Jewish hospital. You see what I'm saying? And these are Jews running it. So it's an advanced stage of, shall I say, assimilation and moving away from traditionalism in many places that people don't know. That damn thing was this Alliance Universelle Israélite, this French organization that started in the 1800s to bring civilization to the benighted Jews of the Orient. And they founded free French schools all throughout the Sephardic areas. I mean, from Iran to Morocco, free schools, which gave a good secular French education. So the French government backed it because part of the cultural imperialism of 100 years ago, okay, of the 1800s, early 1900s. And you'll be Jewish, and the food will be kasher, more or less, but the emphasis is clearly not on Yiddishkeit, as you can see from the pictures. And they turned whole generations of Sephardim not from. That was, in fact, that's part of the agenda. It's a sad story, but they didn't see it that way, obviously. And the result is that over the course of hundreds of thousands, I mean, if you add up Morocco and Algeria and Egypt and Israel too, and Turkey and Persia and other places like that, and they're all over the place. It used to be called in Hebrew, Kol Yisrael Chaverim. And theoretically, it's supposed to protect Jewish rights in the Middle East. But the main emphasis was the cultural one. The Zionists had a big war in the 1890s and early 1900s against the Alliance schools because they teach in French, and they take their graduates and they say, if you're a good student, take you in high school, go over to France and get into college over there, and 99% of the time you don't go back to Israel, you see? So this is the Rothschild era that many of us visit when you go to Israel, you go to Rishon LeZion and all the rest of it. It's a love-hate relationship with the Jewish people. So the Alliance schools were like poison in terms of Yiddishkeit for many decades. And the Sephardic Jews didn't get their act together to fight this. In 1945, however, I don't know how many people know this, starting in America, they start a Sephardic version of Torah Masorah, starting in New York, because the rich guy from the handkerchiefs, Isaac Shalom, if anybody remembers, from the Syrian community, probably have no idea what I'm talking about. I'm talking New York City. Listen, where there's a Syrian community in New York City, yes. Were they kind of separate on their own? Yes. Where'd they live? In Brooklyn, Manhattan, and those places, many of them still live over there. They lived a parallel universe. They had their own institutions and their all the rest of it. And but the only thing is, some of them sent their kids to Torah Vodaas and places like that, and some not because of big cultural differences. You know, Ashkenaz, Sephardi. Some of them got rich, not all. Some got rich. They all went into the manufacturing. What did we talk about? The hats, the shirts. Like everybody else in New York. And this guy cornered the market on the handkerchiefs. Good old days when they had the handkerchiefs. Does anybody still have a handkerchief anymore? Right? And what do you call it? Wait a second. And he was friends with Shraga Feivel Mendelowitz from the Torah Vodaas. And Shraga Feivel Mendelowitz, exactly in 1940s and 45, they said, we're going to launch an effort to do Torah Masorah in the United States of America, to start day schools. Not yeshiva day schools, to rescue whatever's possible to rescue in terms of Yiddishkeit in North America. But you have a different project, and your project is in the Middle East, where you guys came from, and nothing exists to combat the Alliance schools that are devastating the youth of your communities in Syria and elsewhere. By the way, it's coming in a second. And so what was the result? So this guy starts the Otzar Torah, that I'm sure some people have heard about. The Otzar Torah schools is the Torah Masorah for the Sephardic world. That's what it was. In other words, he bankrolled it. And they will create, let's go to the next one, a parallel Sephardi universe. That's what Rabbi Mendelowitz wanted. He said, I want a Torah Masorah for the Sephardim. And I always say like this, who knew about this in America? We're too narrow-minded Ashkenazi. Read this. I guess it's off the internet, that's all. You can do it too. In 1945, read it with me. Syrian-born Isaac Shalom, New York City, together with Joseph Shema Yerushalayim and Ezra Tubal of Buenos Aires. These are Syrian Jews, okay? Worked together to develop a way to offset what they saw as a Jewish spiritual decline and intellectual impoverishment and mandate Palestine, because there are no from schools for the Sephardim that answer to their cultural needs in Israel of old and in the Middle East in general. They founded Otzar Torah, non-profit organization in Jerusalem, under the chairmanship of this guy. The organization began its work, investigation Jewish communities in Palestine and the neighboring Arab countries. They wanted to provide not only good teaching, but food and medical care for the students, immigrants often poor and struggling. That's what the Alliance School offers. You get a lunch. Right? Does anybody remember when they introduced the lunches to the schools over here? Why did they bring the lunch to the public school in America over here? Kids were hungry. Right? Kids were hungry. Why did they bring in the milk 100 years ago, Strauss? It's the rickets. You understand? There was a revolution when the state started offering food. So here you have the same business. Otzar Torah first operated in what was Mandate Palestine, opening 29 schools. After the establishment of Israel, they stopped their operations in Israel, but they went on in nations throughout the Middle East and North Africa, 40 schools in Iran, in which 8,600 students enrolled, and also provided Jewish educations in primary schools at Alliance when they're able to cut that deal. So we'll take care of the Limudei Kodesh part. You see? A lot of politics. You know who was involved in this, by the way? Rabbi Neuberger. It's interesting. Yeah? So a lot of politics. In Syria, I love this, by the way. Look at what I'm about to read. In Syria, Otzar Torah was active in Aleppo and Damascus. The school has 350 students. The schools are funded by the Joint. In 71, under Assad, under that Mamzer Assad, the Damascus school was recognized by the Syrian government education department with the highest grades in the country. This defies, what you imagine. So under the Arab dictatorship, all the rest of it, they got the highest SAT grades. Okay? It's funny. Is there another one here? Yeah. After the massive immigration of Jews from North Africa to France, this one I want to talk about, France, in the late 20th century, when the former colonies gained independence, Otar Torah opened its network to France, because in 1945 there aren't any Sephardic Jews in France, you see? It opened its first school in 61 in Lyon, where many Sephardic Jews had settled, but 71, 2 schools in Créteil and Sarcelles, which are suburbs of Paris. Now these are full of Arabs, right? They're Jewish neighborhoods, but the heavy, it's like what you call today a bad neighborhood, okay? By 2012, they had 1,000 students. This is where you hear about stabbings and things like that. 1,000 students, that's a lot. Subsequently, he set up schools in Toulouse, Marseille, Strasbourg, Aix-les-Bains, and other cities, bringing a total to 20. This in the 60s, 70s. Some maintained with local funds. In the 21st century, Marseille, Otar plans to develop further schools, blah, 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 right? Now, so as I said before, it's a parallel universe most people are not aware of. If you go to Europe and you have friends and relatives there, you know about this. But if you're a Baltimorean and you live in this little bubble over here, so it's just totally out of our knowledge, which is why I'm bringing it to your attention tonight. The point I'm trying to make over here in the context of this series that I'm doing this year, and some of the points I made last week about the American day school, Beis Yaakov TA sociology, is you have this 20 for 25-year business. In other words, the day school revolution doesn't hit France until the late 50s, early 60s. So let's take the next one. No, the one before that? That's it? Okay, that's no problem. So he says, let me put it this way. It's similar to what happens in America, but they're 20 years behind. I tried to make the argument last year that, as we see in Baltimore and other places, if you want a transformation in terms of Yiddishkeit in the community, it takes obviously 12 years or so of a day school, and then another 10 years, 5 years, whatever, of a post-day school, yeshiva, a kollel, a seminary, and this, that, and the other, until then they get married. So you don't start to see the peiros, the results of a day school effect on the community, until you give it 20, 25 years. Okay? So, which is why I tried to argue that if you look at Baltimore, for example, the day schools really start in the late 40s, so you don't start to see I'm talking about high school-wise, you don't start to see the full business till around the 70s, around 1970, approximately. So in France, you have to give it another 10, 15 years, don't you? Because they start later. That's the point I'm trying to make. So giving it 25 years or so for the social, religious consequences to kick in along the lines of what I described, the real effects of the day schools will begin to manifest themselves around the mid-70s, a little bit, and more blatantly in the 80s and afterwards in France, and that is what happened. And that is what happened. There's one crucial difference between American Orthodoxy and French. There is no dynamic yeshiva movement that will develop in France, which is interesting, because they have the numbers, but it takes more than that. Individual boys and girls will go to yeshivas and seminaries in Israel and elsewhere, but there will be no attempt to set up what you could call a Lakewood, or even a Ner Israel. None of that will take root in France, which is interesting, okay? Now, there is a small set of what we call today yeshivas and things like this, and they're rather tiny, they're stark, okay? So, I mean, here's an Aix-les-Bains, and then outside, I mean, you've never heard of these people. This is, what do you call, Chaikin, and Gershon Lehmann, it's Moto Pogromansky. I don't think those names mean hardly anything to most people over here. What? They're Lithuanian rabbis who ended up one way or the other in France, and in the aftermath of the Holocaust, undertook to get whatever refugees and war orphans and things like that they could put together and start schools of various types at the elementary, high school level, and post-high school level. And it's very interesting. If you ever see an article about these things, you can go there today. They're very tall, small, and very intense communities, and they're very serious in their observance, obviously, and they have a strong learning, the boys and the girls, all the rest of it. But it's not like you see here. The yeshivas are just a growing phenomenon that are having a growing sociological impact, good or bad, depending how you look at it, but having a growing sociological impact on American Jewry, okay? So much so that professor I showed you last week, Stephen Cohen, said, oh, the Orthodox are going crazy, with the expansion. I mean, this is a function of the yeshivas. It doesn't take that way. What I'm trying to say is in a country with 750,000 Jews, and the phenomena that I'm describing, you'd imagine there'd be some kind of a Lakewood or something along those lines. And there isn't. So the result, though, is an interesting phenomenon, especially in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, of Moroccan and Tunisian rabbis who become Lithuanianized with the Yiddish speech and dress and all the rest of it. Because they're all going to end up, the religious one going to Israel, a place like Panovich. This is Rabbi Kalmanovich, and this is Moshe Schneider, who were Litvish rabbis who went to North Africa in the 40s and 50s and would bring boys back to Miriam Yeshiva in New York. I remember this when I was a small child, and to London, okay? And when they brought him back, basically the parents said like this: take my kid, because everybody in the street is going enough room. Get it? So take my child, especially rabbis, chazonim, things like that, and take them off there, and they would go there, but they would convert them. No, this is not cultural sensitivity. They would convert them. If you went to Schneider's, even in London, first you got to learn Yiddish, and then you daven Nusach Ashkenaz, and you learn how to do this, and Shmei, and all the rest of it, and this kind of stuff. And that, no, I'm serious. This is the 40s, 50s, and 60s. You understand? This is what it is. And so wait a minute. A lot of these guys became serious Talmidei Chachamim. So in that sense, yes. But it's not the Nusach Sefarad. You know, they're not Moroccan anymore. And there was a lot of this. I'll say it again. I remember from my youth, there were a lot of people in Baltimore and elsewhere that, came from whatever country they came from, but they were like Lakewood guys, and they're, Lemire Yeshiva guys, and Chaim Berlin, and all the rest of it. And they know, and they could be the best guys in learning. And so it's just very interesting, this cultural phenomenon that I'm speaking about over here. These are the guys who started the Shas party in Israel. Okay? If you remember, let's go to the next one. This is Rabbi Yitzhak Peretz, who's from Morocco, who was went to Panovich, exactly what I'm talking about, and became Litvishized and all the rest of it. And he was very close to Rav Shach. And in 82, I think, or 83, Rav Shach told him, I want you to make a party for the Sephardim called Shas. And the idea originally was this should be a party for Sephardim under the control of the Litvish Gedolim. Because Rav Shach was the head of the Litvish world, the head of Panovich, and Rav Peretz was a Talmud of his, a close Talmud, and all the rest of it, and so were the other guys. What happened was they set up this Shas party, and then it got taken over by Sephardim. You understand? Then all of a sudden they said, I guess, what are we into then? We want Rav Yosef. So, that's what happened. But the original impetus to create a separate Sephardi party, which in its heyday, now they're in the decline and decadence, but in its heyday had 20 seats, if you remember. 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, whatever it is. They had a huge following. Notice they blew it, you understand? But the potential is they could be theoretically, I don't know if the biggest party, but one of the biggest parties, without question. They could be, but it didn't happen. But I'm trying, don't be surprised if you'll see what I'm talking about, which is kids from North African background, Tunisia, from Morocco especially. Those are two communities with a very long tradition of Yiddishkeit, of Torah, and the Mesorah, and Minhagim, and all the rest of it. I mean, many famous Sfarim, very big people that most of us don't know about. Unfortunately, it shouldn't be that way. Come from these places, and it had fallen apart by the time you get to 1945, and this is grasping at straws. And so, this is what's happening over here. All during this time, and even today, a mild and silent existential Kulturkampf rages for the identities of young French Jewry. It's still going on. Here in France, there's not really a reform movement, it's very tiny, but there's a Gallicization, which is Frenchification. And many will go non-from, I'm talking about the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s till today, during an era when the supremacy of French culture is uncontested. This is just before the Muslim tidal wave and its cultural challenge to Gallicization. The Jews are not a problem for French culture whatsoever, but the Muslims will be. They'll mount not simply a physical, but also a moral and cultural challenge to the very core values of modern French culture. I simply have to mention one word, the hijab, and you know exactly what I'm talking about. They had to pass a law against it and all the rest of it. What does that mean? It's a direct attack on the French culture. The Jews never did anything. The Jews did something like this. We'd like to live like, a little square town on our own or something like that. As in America, the majority of the French Jewish kids will be non-frum, but a significant minority, a larger percentage in America, will, as the 20th century proceeds, certainly by the 70s, start to get more of a religious chinuch, and being Sephardic, they will influence their non-religious relatives, because the Sephardim are not like the Ashkenazim where they cut off relations with the non-religious cousin. That's a sad reality of the 20th century. Everybody's got relatives, all the rest of it. You don't really see them except once in a while, and the next generation, they don't see them at all. And the Sephardim don't have a tradition like that. You come together, you see, I remember I used to go stay in hotels in Israel years ago when I did these conferences in the Hebrew, in the Machon Limudim Kadmim, in what do you call it? Not in Mount Scopus, the other one. And give it around, yeah. And so they always put you up in these hotels nearby. And so the kosher top was a very modern place. And every night was some Sephardi family, like a bar mitzvah or a bris or something like that. And it's so, because I used to leave and come back, and you used to see, it's a disco, but half the place is dressed this way, the other half of the family is dressed totally different. Everybody's having a good time. You know what I'm saying? They keep up the family ties. So because of that, when you're going to start to have the kid that goes to one of these schools, and they're going to come back and say, we need more kashrut and more Shabbat and more all the rest of it, the other relatives may make fun of it, but little by little, they will usually adjust. And therefore, you have a slow, right wing turn religiously within French Jewry. It's a very interesting phenomenon. They don't have time to go into great detail. The Ashkenazi French Jewish establishment at first freaks out in the 1950s and 60s. What they cannot suppress, they try to marginalize, as in classic French style. That's what they did in the 19th century. But over time, even the consistoire, even the head organization of French Jewry has to acknowledge reality. It can't be that 2% control the other 98%. And you can even see what I'm talking about in terms of just look at the pictures of the succeeding chief rabbis of France. The first one over here is Alsatian, meaning French. That's this guy. And then the second one is a Litvak. I know they don't look like it. That's Rabbi Schwartz, Shai Schwartz. He's a Litvak, which shows you the wave of the Eastern European Jews. The third one, Rabbi Sirat, is Algerian. So he's North African, but very French. He's a from guy who went to Sorbonne. The fourth guy is a Haredi. He's Tunisian, Rabbi Sitruk. He died not long ago. And he was a from guy. He was like Rav Shach, you understand? I mean, his friends in Israel and in Bnei Brak. And France has gone a long way, baby. From this is Rabbi Kaplan, right? It's from France to the other one. It's what it is. By the way, I got this wrong. Rabbi Schwartz is Alsatian, Rabbi Kaplan was a Litvak. I beg your pardon. Now, in other words, two coincidental tendencies. Jews are moving to the right and Jews are moving to the left. The center does not hold, as that famous poem goes. Okay? Jews are moving to the right and doing the left in the second half of the 20th century. There's a big hush of a left. Who's this? Bernard-Henri Lévy? Right? He's a rock star. I mean, for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, he's intellectual. I say a rock star in the sense of being, a radioactive figure in French life and all the rest of it. And he's constantly on TV. He's a philosopher. Okay? This is Alan Finkielkraut. These are well-known names in France because they don't have a culture like America where everything's dumbed down. We have our intellectuals over here, but the popular culture in this country is gone. Okay? The popular country is crashed. It's all about junk. They're the college educated and a few people keep to themselves, but the public sphere doesn't know about that. When's the last time you saw so I've seen TV in a long time, I'm sure, when's the last time you saw some show and they bring a professor of philosophy on? It's an oxymoron in America. France is every day. You understand? It's a philosopher, it's an artist, it's a difficult writer, it's a modernist. They have this strong cultural tradition that they give great prestige to. And Jews are a very important part of it, right? These guys are on the left. That is to say, in the European intellectual left. You understand? They're major figures over there. You also have, as I just told you before, you have these yeshivas and things like this on the right. And then you have a combination of both. That's Levinas, right? Well, hold on for a second. Ooh. to hold him for a second. Emmanuel Levinas is a Litvak who immigrates to France before the war, and I can never find out for sure if he's a Shomer Shabbat, but very traditional. And he had a funny story, by the way. He did his doctorate, I think, before the war. Then he was in the French army, and because in the French army, the whole French army, as you know, was captured by Hitler, 1, 2, 3. So that was good, because then he wasn't sent to Auschwitz. He was in the POW French army camp. That's how he survived the war. It's funny. But when the war's over, he will teach in the Alliance Universal schools. But he is he gets his philosophical training under Heidegger and Husserl and all these big names and all the rest of it. And he will be a major figure in the French culture in the second half of the 20th century. And he's very Jewish. He writes about how to read the Talmud. His books on 7 Talmudic readings and 9 Talmudic readings were like bestsellers in France. Okay? And the reason, what I'm going to show you is like this. He's on a popular French TV show surrounded by young people, and they're talking about things that are totally over the head of any of us. It's a different culture over there, because you can read the captions. Yeah, take a look at this.
Bonsoir, Emmanuel Levinas. Dieu, la mort, le temps sont les textes de vos cours que vous avez professés dans l'année scolaire 75-76. Alors je vais vous présenter, vous êtes un des philosophes sans doute les plus importants de la pensée française, mais en même temps, beaucoup de gens ne vous connaissent pas parce que vous n'êtes pas, comment dire, médiatisé, comme on dit aujourd'hui. Je ne connais pas du tout les docteurs. Il en est probablement que les messieurs sont manifestés, mais qui se manifestent dans l'intimité, par le public, dans le fond, un peu comme l'occasion, peut-être une chance de l'honneur, de porter aujourd'hui. Qu'est-ce que vous pensez justement de cette sorte de bruit, de vacarme, de publicité qui est obligée aujourd'hui d'entourer la publication des livres par rapport à un exercice solitaire et rigoureux de la pensée? Une logique, évidemment, de se traîner des idées générales, des idées intimes, une discussion publique, sans préparation, sans contact préalable avec le texte. Et pour moi, l'enseignement verbal présuppose toujours un approfondissement des choses écrites. Le geste de l'arrêt était aussi important que le geste d'écrire. Alors je vais présenter rapidement. Vous êtes né en 1906 en Lituanie, vous êtes exilé d'abord en Russie, ensuite en France, à Strasbourg. Vous avez commencé vos études de philosophie en même temps que vous nouiez un rapport amical avec Maurice Blanchot. En 1928, vous êtes parti à Fribourg suivre l'enseignement de Husserl et de Heidegger. Ensuite, il y a eu évidemment la guerre, les camps, la montée du nazisme, et on peut dire que cette tragédie de l'histoire est inscrite au cœur de notre réflexion. On dirait que, enfin vous me direz si c'est un bon résumé, une bonne situation, que votre pensée se situe à un carrefour de domaines qui sont d'habitude très séparés les uns des autres, et que vous avez inlassablement tenté de nouer un dialogue entre des traditions qui s'ignoraient. Je pense notamment à la tradition de la philosophie occidentale et la tradition hébraïque, mais aussi la littérature russe qui a beaucoup compté pour vous, la phénoménologie allemande. Est-ce que cette situation de carrefour, c'était un choix ou c'est finalement une conséquence de l'histoire de ce siècle? Ce n'était pas un choix, en ce sens que je ne sais pas de ne pas coller et se demander chaque fois qu'est-ce que j'en retiens. Une pensée authentique, une pensée sincère, c'est un recours au texte, au grand texte surtout, quelques grands textes qui souvent sont plus d'accord entre eux que nous pensons, et la liberté, il appelle aux auteurs différents, et certainement ici, il n'est pas du tout le moment le plus profond de réflexion. C'est une réflexion qui s'attache à une expression par excellence, une grande expression, et qui peut être à l'origine d'une rencontre quelconque et d'une discussion. On peut dire de vous,
que vous êtes le penseur par excellence du rapport à l'autre, du rapport à autrui. Et vous avez toujours essayé de penser ce qui était constitutif finalement du rapport à l'autre.
Là, vous aimez à le faire, un de mes thèmes préférés, et non pas du tout parce que c'est un thème qui me permet de mon développement, mais parce qu'il me semble être au cœur de ce qu'est l'humain, de sa chose humain. Et si vous dans ma réflexion, de cette fiction,
that's enough. You can look at the rest if you're actually interested. The reason I gave you extended business like this, the last time I remember was Johnny Carson. I don't know who took his place. Can you imagine a thing like that on American TV? You get what I'm saying? In other words, in its pure celebration of intellectuality, all that, it's a different world. Okay? And the reason I mention is they're Jews, like Levinas and like Finkelkraut, who become top figures in the French culture, but always in an interesting relationship to their Judaism, okay? And usually it's more one, less the other. Levinas is an interesting combination of kind of both. But as you know, unlike the culture in America, which we're in a Philistine country, France glorifies highbrow philosophers and intellectuals. By the way, you can get highbrow anything in this country, but it's in very restricted circles. You see? You can go to Baltimore. I mean, you can anywhere. But it's not out there in the popular culture. So French Jewry in these years will be sui generis. It'll be a lively Jewish community, but somehow always dependent on outsiders for potent Yiddishkeit and Torah knowledge. It's kind of interesting in that way. They won't generate things in their own. They'll send their kids off to Israel, send kids, people come and speak there, but not the other way around. It's an interesting question that Diaspora raises for us is, what is it that is required to set up a Jewish community that not only takes but gives? It's interesting. But let's move on. What about the rest of Europe? You'd be surprised to hear that in the 70s, Hungary and Romania, and to a small degree, Czechoslovakia and Poland have a couple 100,000 Jews. There's a lot left over. But they're exhausted volcanoes. It's a sad story. It's a population that's generally aging, no kids. These are people beaten up by the 20th century. They don't want to move to Israel. I know the type. I had relatives like this. They want to live back in their old country just with the pension and live out their years. They're broken by life, by the Holocaust. There are 50,000 Jews in Budapest. At that time, there are shuls there. There are gravas there. I saw one or two myself. We don't think of Budapest under the communists as a country with 50,000 Jews, as a capital city. It's not what you think. But once again, the tour d'horizon of the diaspora raises the interesting question, what is it that's required to make things have that chemical reaction where all of a sudden you have a bubbling and active and vibrant Jewish life? It's not over there. So you see the insignificant Jewish community, a quantity bereft of cultural quality. It's sad. So you can look at communities, but you can't tell which is an important Jewish community simply by the numbers, because it doesn't go like that. Unfortunately, the communist regimes in Eastern Europe were very good at that. They don't practice physical, but they very successfully practice a cultural genocide. And it's impossible to do anything active Jewish, impossible to do anything. And you can live and nobody bothers you, provided you keep your nose clean and your head down. And that's what people do. And so the synagogue is a very sad place to visit in Eastern Europe in the 70s and the 80s and before that. Ironically, Eastern and Central Europe had been the cradle of the modern efforts to create a vibrant secular Jewish culture, right? I mean, that's what Eastern Europe is. Just read this new book, The Book Smugglers, where you give you a little bit of the very vibrant culture and the eve of the Holocaust in Lithuania, for example, in Vilna. We have poets and writers and a public that comes to hear the readings, and all the isms started in Eastern and Central Europe, right? What do you call it? Socialism and Zionism and Yiddishism and all the others. But of course, the Holocaust came and destroyed it. And even though they were liberated by the Russians, there's no Jewish vibrant secular culture that survives under the Reds, because that's not what they want. They don't want any Jewish culture whatsoever. The communists didn't say, okay, these are secular atheists. That's the guys that are back, we want to back them. No, if there's anything Jewish, we don't want to have it. What happened, if you read this book, what happens to the Yiddish library left over from Vilna? They buried it in the bottom of a church. in Lithuania, which is there. It's there, but you can only get it in, it's under a government regulation, and it's not out for the public. So it doesn't actually get known until communism falls, and then the evil people from New York go there in the 90s. So that's what it is. And there's also no vibrant future for Yiddish and Eastern European secular culture in the West. I don't think anybody even knows, probably in this audience even knows who's on the screen now, right? Nishtah Kenoilam, that's the number one Yiddish poet after the Holocaust. Who's that? Avram Sutzkever. Yeah, that's the name, that's my point. You don't even know what I'm talking about. It's Nishtah Kenoilam anymore, The readership is gone. He was in Israel. He made it there right after the Holocaust. He's a big name, right? I could bring Chaim Grada and all these people. Totally separating question of the quality of work. Let's say it's good. There's no interest. Not in Eastern Europe under the Reds and not in Western Europe under freedom. It's interesting. In general, in my opinion, the Yiddish, the 70s was the last decade for Yiddish. That's when you still had people that survived the war, you know what I mean? And were not old and decrepit yet. And they still had some, groups and population that was still talking about it, but not the kids, right? They're not interested. From and not from, each one its own way. It's interesting. It didn't go. Now let's turn our attention to the other part of the diaspora, which would be Latin America. Not much to talk about over there. In Latin America, you got lots of Jews. It's 350,000 Jews in Buenos Aires. It's more than 3 times what you have in Baltimore. But nothing's happening in terms of culture, not from Jewish culture, not unfrom Jewish culture. It's the advanced stage of acculturation to the Argentine. That's all. You understand? Kids, some more traditional family, you marry a Jew, you don't marry a Jew. Yeah, there's like I say, the old generation talks Yiddish, younger generation already talking Spanish. You can live a full life without much Judaism whatsoever. It's really, to the best of my knowledge, and I'm no expert on this, I think it's still like that. You understand? And so what do you have in Brazil and Chile and all those ways? You have large numbers of Jews, more than you'd imagine in some of these communities. You understand? You do. And hasn't come together. Which the numbers are such that they should have. There was nothing objectively stopping a country like Argentina, which I said had 400,000 Jews, 350,000 in one city, from creating, whether you want a secular or a religious, vibrant Jewish culture in the aftermath of World War II. Why not? It didn't happen. So once again, you see the interesting question I raise again and again tonight, which is when you take a survey of the diaspora, what is the magic formula that it takes to make something happen, cooking, vibrant, controversial, full of fights, let's say, but it's a sign of life, and then just the other thing. It's quite interesting. If you're talking about Latin America, you got, in the 70s, certainly got your lower level anti-Semitism everywhere. Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, that's how it goes. But it's balanced, because we're talking about the 1970s already. It's balanced because there does exist a state of Israel, and there does exist something more powerful than the state of Israel. What is more powerful to South Americans than the state of Israel? Oh, you said, no. American Jewry. Okay? They run the world. Okay? Well, you can laugh all you want. They run the world. After all, which is more powerful? American Jewry or Israel? Kissinger is running America. He's obviously an agent for the Protocols of Zion. There's nothing to talk about. If you're read the newspapers and magazines from South America in the 1970s. What's there to talk about? You understand? He's the agent for the Wall Street and all the rest of it, and therefore don't do too much anti-Semitism or the American Jews will get you. Yeah, I'm talking about mentalities over here, but it's not fair to laugh at it because it exists and it's a reality, and therefore that which is real you can't laugh at. Okay. Just to give you an example, the president of Mexico voted for the Zionism is Racism resolution in 1975, Luis Echeverria. And he did. And he did it because he was planning to run for UN Secretary General. He thought he would kiss up to the third world and all that kind of business. But the Mexican Jews were so angry and then came down, I forget which rabbi from the American Jewish Committee, all the others, oh my goodness, Echeverria, and so he goes, oh, I didn't mean it, it's a mistake, I pressed the wrong button, and all the rest of it. Why'd he do that? You understand? Oh my goodness. If you don't watch out, the American Jews will have you deposed. You see? They'll put somebody else in there. It's like the protocols of Zion. They buy into this sort of business. In general, the trope of American Jewish power, I repeat, American Jewish power, resounds throughout the world. They said it, they've regurgitated so many years themselves, they believe it. You understand? When you say it over and over again, you believe it. And this has a very powerful impact. This is another way of reading history. I'll say it again. If you're a South American non-Jew living in the 1970s, how do you explain Kissinger? How did a foreign Jew become the head of American foreign policy? How do you explain Nixon's support of Israel despite the oil embargo? They don't get that. How do you explain that in Guatemala? How do you explain that in Venezuela? How do you explain that in Colombia and in Brazil and in Chile? It doesn't make any sense. Countries operate on national interests. How come Nixon's backing Israel even though it's jacking up the oil price in America? They don't get it. Well, the answer is to push it. Nixon is an agent of the Jews. What else is what is there to talk about? It's a different reading of history. Look at Hitler. Hitler called the Jewish bluff, and the Jews got him. That's how they read it. Okay. Today, unfortunately, you can see it on the websites if you want. It's ordinarily I'd say smile and laugh at it. It's nothing to smile at. It's nothing to laugh at because that's the reality for these people. As I said 100 times, if you go around the world and you ask people, this is sad. If you go around the world and you ask people who did 9/11, most of the people, right, is Israel and Mossad and oh what, and you can't snicker and all the rest of it. That's what they believe. You see. And now I turn my attention to another very important community that existed at that time in the mid-70s, Iran. We forget. As late as the mid-70s, it's the Shah. Okay, the last years of the Shah. So you still had the good years, so to speak, for the Jews in that sense, but it was the clock was ticking, right? Now Iran is actually, I would say, it's not funny. It's a funny story. Let's go to the next one. Will success spoil rock hunter? Iran was destroyed. This is a funny story. Iran was destroyed by getting too much money. Read up on it. You'll see. The Shah is the guy, he deserved, the Shah is the guy who jacked up the oil prices. He's the one who started it, if you examine, right? He was the one pushing for it before it happened, and he's the one who jacked up the oil prices. And the idea was like this, then Iran will take in billions, which they did do, but nobody ever did, let's go to the next one, nobody ever thought what'll happen, will you do it correctly, right? What do you do if you have billions? Can you handle that? Just as intelligently as a country. You say, what are you talking about? If there's billions in America, if we took in billions and trillions, we'll pay off the national debt or something like that. That's the first intelligent thing that comes to mind. I don't know more than that. They really didn't know more than that. They took in the money, they spent it on a couple of infrastructure projects like roads and schools, all the rest of it. It didn't trickle down to the people. And consequently, you have a ton of new money in the country, and it's not trickling down to people. Hyperinflation is a kleptocracy. Who's stealing all the money? The Shah and all the guys. You're a regular schnook in Iran. Your bread is going up in price. Your milk is going up in price. They're living beyond. They're taking zillions and schmillions because of the high oil prices. None of it's trickling down. Right? One would think you have a little bit of sense. You lower the taxes. You start new industries. You actually subsidize the food better. You can afford to do it now. You lower the prices. You make life better for the people. And that makes you popular, right? Not in that part of the world. You got it, you grab it. That's what it is. And what was the result? He shot himself in the foot, as we all know. So you have unemployment jacking up. Isn't that weird? They're taking billions and billions, and the unemployment went up because the inflation wrecked all the businesses. It's a classic case of how not to run an empire. Why didn't he bring in somebody from Harvard? I don't know the answer to that. All I know is they grabbed every penny that they could. Turns out, he was the wrong guy, right? Like I said a couple weeks ago, you need a kohelis, right? Shlomo Melech talks about what do you do to make sure the vanity is not vanity. How to use the money correctly, right? Because the point is not to get the money. The point is to make the life of the people better, to increase happiness. But that requires something called philosophy. The Shah of Iran don't have no philosophy. You get it? The words I'm saying, he wouldn't even understand what I'm talking about. Right? He wouldn't understand what I'm talking about. All he knows is, kicha mistayefron. This is how it works over there. And what was the result? The oil money tore him down. It's actually funny. You understand? The oil money tore him down. See, he was no Koheles. Now, for the Jews in Iran, it was a golden era, because the Jews are not a threat to the regime. So the regime is always looking at the, Ayatollah Khomeini types and the disgruntled urban, intellectuals. All that. Jews is not a problem. It was not a golden era in terms of Yiddishkeit. Ask the Iranian Jews themselves. Judaism was falling apart in Iran, just like it was falling apart elsewhere, thanks to the Alliance schools and things like that. The ones who came to Baltimore became religious in Baltimore. They went to yeshiva and places like that. Over there, it wasn't so great. You understand? But on the other hand, as I said before, they're not. Politically, it's okay because they're not a threat to the regime. The others are the threat to the regime. He's the threat to the regime. As I always say, Westerners generally cannot understand the nature of religious charisma. Frum Jews ought to be able to, but sometimes they don't. And therefore, the public simply rejected in principle everything the Shah stood for, and they embraced in principle everything this guy stood for, even if they weren't comfortable with all of it, because he represented to them, in their version of Torah's emes. The Shah is a radically flawed, selfish person. That's who he was. As are all absolute monarchs, I think. By the 1970s, he's running a savak, a police state. And a police state, where your basis of power is the secret police, as a pre-revolutionary situation. You know what I said? I'm talking about from basic politics point of view. Like, he didn't learn from history. The Russian czars, by the time it was over, were running on the police. You can't have, that means you have no support out in the general society. Then it's just a question of when, right? A halfway intelligent government does political and economic policies to win over to their side segments of the population. I'll give you an example. You break up the estates and you give the money to give the land to the poor people. Now the peasantry out there is supporting you, for example, right? Or you build up industry so you get the capitalist sector out there to support you. Or you build up the unions against the industry, you get the workers out there. You got to have some kind of policy where some groups in the society are benefiting from your policies. If he's running a state in which it's the secret police, it's a kleptocracy. You understand? Knows the people, a few people are stealing everything, and the police are just there to arrest anybody and make them shut up. That's not a healthy situation. We all know what happened over there. So the Shah treats the Jews well. That's the first time in Persian history. You know what I said? It's the first time in Persian history in the centuries that the Jews were treated okay. But why? Because the Jews control America, so you want to mess with that. Okay? I mean, when he sees Kissinger, he knows he's the Secretary of State of the United States, but of course he also knows Kissinger is the representative of the real people that control the United States of America. And we all know who that is. And the Shah is a Middle Eastern dictator, so he says, I'm not fighting with it, I just adjust to it. That's all, I just adjust to it. The Shah has diplomatic relations with Israel for the same reasons. You don't want to antagonize the American Jews. That's why he has a relation with Israel. And also because the Mossad helps him. This is unfortunate because it means the Mossad, starting in the 50s, helped him set up his Mossad, the Savak, which was a very brutal kind of secret police force, which is not healthy. But Israel figures, what can they do? Israel has many countries in which they maintain these often secret, realpolitik relationships, like the dictator in Niger over here, the guy who used to be the dictator in Singapore. That's what Israel does because they can't get any kind of thing. Lee Kuan-yew was for 30 years a dictator. Now he was a very efficient one, and all that sort of thing. But they run by the secret police. It's people like it or don't like it. That's what it is. Why does Israel do this? How else are they going to get into Indonesia? So Indonesia denounces Israel and publicly, and this and that and the other. They're doing all the sorts of things, but secretly, the secret police here are cooperating with secret police over there, and that's true. I'm sorry to say, around the world. Bibi is doing this right now in Africa. If you follow the news, if you understand what's going on, okay, that's where he went to Rwanda and I don't know these other places. Israel is giving them what they call security assistance. That's the technical term these days. I want to make one thing clear. The good years of the Shah-Israel relationship were the 60s, not the 70s. In the 60s, you had some amazing things going on. They helped Israel get that stolen MiG that they took from Iraq. Israel helped them when they had an earthquake. Lova Aliyev, a famous Israeli, brought a whole team in that province that was devastated by an earthquake, and they gave them significant help and things like that. There were other cases, but by the 1970s, there's a slow and steady deterioration of the relationship based on the fact that the Shah is a calculating son of a gun out of the 18th century European political world. And he's simply saying, in the 18th century, today you're my friend, tomorrow you're my enemy, the next day he's my friend, and all this complete cynicism. And Israel can't exactly operate this way. And therefore, the relationship started to go down. There was no Mossad heaven by the 1970s. It's a one-way street. Israel helped the Shah, but the Shah didn't help Israel. He sold Israel oil, but he backs Sadat in the Kissinger negotiations, and he sanctioned Israel very often economically in the 1970s for being insufficiently flexible towards making concessions towards Sadat and the Syrians. If you look it up, people have forgotten this. If you look up, you'll see. So he already was like biting the hand, and he said also, watch out the Jews, Mom's 18th century, like Maria Theresa or something like this. How's this in my interest today? And he couldn't get out of that way of thinking. Worst of all, he messed over Israel and the Kurds to cut a deal with Saddam Hussein in the middle of the 1970s, in 1975. This is a famous, notorious episode. Very briefly, because this is Nogea today, and maybe I'll talk about it next week. The Kurds are living in Iraq and in Iran and in Turkey. The Kurds in Iran are not such a problem. The Kurds in Iraq are a big problem for the Iraqi government. It's the Saddam Hussein era. And so Israel, starting in 1965, before Saddam Hussein came along, Israel, the Mossad, 1965, met with the Kurds, and it's a natural alliance, because you don't like the Iraqis and we don't like the Iraqis. And actually, I've told you in the past, the Kurds happen to be a Muslim group who are not anti-Semitic. It's funny, they're not anti-Semitic, the leadership, and they're not anti-Israel. Okay, it's not. And so, already long ago, Israel made a deal to help them with military weapons and things like that. They gave them health care, all kinds of things, going back to Barzani's time. Showed you a picture before where Meir Amit, the head of the Mossad, goes over there. You can't look at geography. You can't do it without Iran. You got to have a country that Israel can send them the help. And so the Shah of Iran, in the 60s, when times were good with Israel, so he said, okay, and they kept going the Kurdish resistance, the uprising, to the Saddam Hussein dictatorship. And the Iraqi army cannot beat him. But in the 70s, the Shah starts saying like this, why am I helping, this is what he said, these words, why am I helping a bunch of damn Jews? I don't care about this. I can cut a better deal with Saddam Hussein. Iran and Iraq argued over a little piece of water. So Saddam was saying like this, I'll let you have the water and you let me have the Kurds. And so that's what happened. It's an extremely cynical deal. And he told the Mossad, you're out of here now. And they got out like a few hours before the Iraqi army came in. Now, did this help the Shah in the long run? Not a bit. It just exposed him for being a person. When we say today, the Shah is gone and now it's so much worse, that is true, but don't make him out to be a good person. You understand? So it's a very tricky kind of a business that we're dealing with over here. But for Iran's Jews, it was a good times, except he had a lot of inflation. Because it was a good time, there's no aliyah in the mid-70s. Things will change in a few years when the revolution comes, but not under the Shah. The Israeli ambassador to Iran, Uri Librani, was a very smart guy from the Mossad, and he discerned the clouds on the horizon. Already in 75 and 76, he said the Shah is losing it, the country's breaking away from him, Israel better get ready for this, but nobody else discerns this. He tries to warn the Shah about provoking the Islamic clergy too much, but the Shah is on a megalomaniacal binge. Israeli specialists, I told you, help Iran, but Iran don't help Israel. So that's the story. Within a few years, the Iranian diaspora would undergo its profound reality, as we know, but right now it did not. After Europe and Latin America and Iran, the other significant diaspora is only one is in the English-speaking world. Outside the United States. The English-speaking world, of course, is the UK, is Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. I only have time, it's late, to talk a little bit about South Africa, but just tell you a few things. Same way we don't know anything about France. and even though it's in our lifetime, I don't think most of us have an idea what's going to South Africa. South Africa, once upon a time in the 70s, used to be an economic paradise. If you were white. If you were black, it was not an economic paradise, okay? The apartheid laws were legislated, as you know, back in the late 40s. By the 70s, with the rest of Africa going through gaining black independence, the white minority regimes seemed doomed, which they were. I mean, how long can you go on like this forever, even if you're Afrikaner? So in other words, just look at the map. This whole bunch of states, for better or worse, all got independent and are now self-ruled. They're all black-ruled African states, down to here. Now look what I'm pointing at. This area is still held by the whites. Angola, Mozambique is held by Portugal. This is all part of South Africa, where this is Zimbabwe, this would be Rhodesia. So it's like a redoubt, you understand? It's like a last fortress. I get it. How long is this going to go? Can you see the handwriting on the wall? How long is this going to go? As Harold Macmillan put in a famous speech in 1961, he said the winds of change are coming. You know, how realistic is this? But in the 70s, they tried to hold out. Okay, Zimbabwe changed in the late 70s, and there's already guerrilla warfare going on in some of these areas by the 70s. So keep that in mind. Now, by the 70s, the economy starts to go down for the first time in South Africa. Because let me put it this way. If you're an American company, do you want to invest? Is there a long-term future in South Africa? There's a short-term future, but not a long-term future. You see what I'm saying? So the business climate is one that does not inspire confidence, and that's the first time ever the South African economy started to go down. It always was on the up. But meanwhile, there's a very interesting Jewish story, an interestingly similar chinuch story, but with its own local variation, takes place in post-1945 South African Jewish environment. Up to 1945, you had 120,000 Jews in South Africa. Most of them came from Lithuania, or the children of people came from Lithuania, actually central Lithuania. It's highly concentrated. Traditional, but not from 99%. At very small numbers, they're interested in, observant, full Shomer Shabbos. But on the other hand, they're very traditional, and being South Africa, they all hang around each other, they marry with each other, they belong to the same clubs, and the synagogues and all that. A lot of people, it's the old school, like this Friday. Friday night, you go to shul, they do, and then you come home, and you light candles, and then you have the Shabbat meal, and then everybody goes to the movies and this and that and the other. This was the life in those days, and they were well off. The feelings, however, after the Holocaust begin everywhere across the English-speaking world that you want something more intensive. If they started a Torah Masorah in America and they started Otzar Torah in the Sephardic world, they start to have the beginnings of a feeling that we want something more intense here in South Africa, in this very interesting place. But we don't want it too intense, not in the 40s. So what you have is the what I call Best Tefillah. These are the King David schools, which start in 48, and which is Mamish Best Tefillah. It's traditional, God forbid, not too much, and it's very good secular education. A very good secular education. The food is kosher, all the rest of it. But don't push the thing too much. No, because you'll turn off the parents. So it's a Best Tefillah situation. But what about those who want something that's more from? In those years, if it's South Africa, it's a Zionist community. If Aguda doesn't exist, maybe. So where's the heart of Yiddishkeit and Shmir Shabbos and everything else? It's Bnei Akiva. Okay, that's what it is. Somebody came to me last week. He's complaining. He said, "I'm from Chicago. Why don't you mention Bnei Akiva?" In South Africa, it is Bnei Akiva. That is the place in which you'll have young people who are interested in Shmir Shabbat. Let's get this straight, in kosher food and all the rest of it. So it's like I said before, it's a different. And what that means is that within the best of Bnei Akiva circles, they come together only in 1955 to start the first day school, what we would call Frum. It's as I say before, it's like a TA with more Zionism. Okay? It's not exactly Rambam, it's like a TA with more Zionism. And this is welcome to the world of South Africa, where things, as I said before, are parallel but different. And what ends up is a very, very interesting combination that you couldn't imagine over here in America, because the people end up running the school, they're from Telz in Cleveland. So it's a combination of Telz and Bnei Akiva. okay? Which in America would be like a tarta de sastre or something like that. Not in South Africa. You understand? They don't experience that way. There are no Hasidim, right? There's no Hasidim, there's no black hats, there's no aguda and that kind of business. It's just people want to be from, like that. And so the start, though, is relatively late if it's the mid-50s, okay? And there's no yeshiva gedola post-high school until the 70s. When again, Rabbi Tanzer came over to take over the day school. He's from Telz, and that's the guy dancing. And then he brought in a friend of his, Rabbi Goldfein. This is Rosh Hashiva. Somebody can't get more litfish than this. This is a guy, you never heard of, I know, I'm aware, I'm describing a parallel universe, unless there are South Africans over here, but we Baltimoreans in North Africa, you have no idea what I'm talking about. Rabbi Tanzer had this school that they built up into like this TA in Bnei Akiva, and then for boys and girls, and then he wanted something to post high school to intensify. So he brought in an old chavrus of his from Telus, Cleveland, Rabbi Israel Goldfein, who's a Minneapolis boy, who went to Telus in the 50s and was a close student of Gifter. And they so Telus they don't have a beard, real Litvish, so it'll be a perfect match for South Africa. They figure the same kind of business, and they start slow and they build up a yeshiva post, like we call yeshiva, Shiva Gedola, post high school place. And what's the point? I don't think many people know about this. Used to be until then, and this is the point last point I want to make tonight, very important point. Used to be until then, when a boy went off to Cleveland or Bnei Brak or a place like that, they didn't return back to South Africa, they were lost. As is true of so many communities in America today. The local boy goes off to Lakewood, to this and the other, that's the end of them. They're no longer going back to St. Louis, to Milwaukee, to Seattle, to Minneapolis and all these other places. Now you have, with the rise of this, the beginnings of an infrastructure that keep the boys at home, okay? The yeshiva keeps them in South Africa. It's a famous story when the first kids in the 1950s, a few, went to Punovich and a place like that, is the South African kids, and they went to the first time Israeli dorm room. Every night they put their shoes outside, because back home, they said somebody comes and cleans them overnight, shine the shoes for the morning. And the Israeli said, what are you talking about? It's a culture difference. Here you're talking about homegrown. So now you have, if you want, the equivalent of Baltimore. You can go from K through 12, and from 12 through Smicha and Kollel if you want, and in Johannesburg. You know what I'm saying? In Johannesburg. And so they will have what a lot of places in the United States of America do not have, as I just told you. See, I go, as you know, speaking a lot of times around the country, and I'm always, you see nice communities, I'm always asking people, for your own community's sake, how come they can't get their act together to build some yeshiva, like a Ner Israel or something like that, with college and yeshiva and college program here in town to keep the people, when they reach a certain age, they settle down and marry, and other people coming over here, Seattle, St. Louis, Milwaukee, Atlanta's trying, all these places, a lot of nice communities out there, there really are, and they're pretty and all the rest of it. It's gatenished. It's an interesting phenomenon. It's not so simple. So here's a case where they try to do it. Because of the time lag, this started in the 70s, what I'm talking about. The yeshiva started in the 70s. You got to give it, South Africa, another 20, 25 years before you start to see the frum effect. You do, baby. Starting in the 90s and afterwards, it's a very frum place. Right? You see the beginnings of a large bunch of schools, kollels, obviously kosher restaurants, synagogues, and all the rest of it, right in the middle of Johannesburg and Cape Town and places like that. It will be strange that in the same era, the conditions deteriorate after Mandela and the African National Congress come to power. Yiddishkeit will grow in South Africa qualitatively and quantitatively from its humble beginnings. Here's the well-known chief rabbi of South Africa, Warren Goldstein. I think it was Mandela. He was a friend of Nelson Mandela. As you see, he spoke at his funeral. And I would tell you something. Warren Goldstein is a local boy. He went to that TA in Beis Yaakov school. He went afterwards under Rabbi Goldfein, to the Yeshiva Gedola. He has a smicha from over there. He settled in South Africa. He got a law degree like Ner Israel in Baltimore, and became and he's a very well-spoken person, all the rest of it. And he still lives down there. And as I said before, he was a friend with Nelson Mandela and with the successors. You understand? With the successors. I don't have a picture to show you, but it's really funny. He gave a speech at a memorial for Nelson Mandela I think on the Shloshim or something like that. And look, they had, and they had a guy, an African guy, giving the sign language. But after they looked at it, they said like this, it's gibberish, like they paid him, but it wasn't really the sign language, all the rest of it. So we have these kind of things around the world. Look, there's a whole lot more to talk about, but it's so very late, so I bid you good night. Freilich and Purim.